Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you from Film Fanatic headquarters. It is a Sunday at about 10:14. Hope everyone's doing good. Maybe you're on your way home, or maybe you're on your way to church. Just kidding. But yeah, thanks everyone for their support for this channel. It's been a fun ride. I just did a big show on probably, well, definitely my favorite Blu-ray that I have. It's always a funny thing when, I got in a conversation with a friend recently who I know is like way, way into music, and she actually writes. At one point, when I met her years ago, she was kind of a booking agent. She also, I met her through this band that I was playing in, and actually her husband was in the band, and I met her through that connection, and this was going back, geez, probably close to 10 years ago now. It was actually one of the first bands that I started playing with pretty regularly, and it was an all original band. Before that point, I was, as a drummer, I was slowly networking. I had just kind of moved to Maine, and I went through this whole period where I was going to this open mic. There was a really cool open mic at this coffee shop that still exists in Belfast, but it is now it's changed a couple of locations, but it's still in Belfast, and it's very very different now. But I used to go to this open mic at this one coffee shop, and I didn't know anybody there. I didn't know a soul in Maine other than because my parents had moved here, and I was living in Boston, and I was going back and forth for a while, and I wasn't sure if I was going to live in Boston or live here in Maine. And I even had, I grew up in New York, so I had connections still in Maine, and I thought maybe moving back there. I was kind of going back and forth for a while, and then eventually I moved here. And I started going to this coffee shop. I had met this guy who, his name was Damien, and he was into a lot of punk rock, and he was into, a lot of hardcore music. But we kind of, made this connection, and we had, there were certain bands that we were both really into, and he was a really cool guy, and he was a little bit of a musician. He played a little bit of guitar, and I remember meeting him randomly somewhere, and we kind of hit it off. And then he had told me about this open mic that was going on every week, and it was well, it was mostly like a jazz jam, and there was also a couple other open mics going. So he had told me about that, and I went to this open mic, and then eventually I met, quite a few people through that connection. I met a whole bunch of musicians that I still now play with, and most notably, my really really good friend Mike Whitehead, who plays bass in Quantum. I met him there, and it was so funny because I was in my early 20s, and I met him there. He plays bass in Quantum, and he plays bass in a couple other projects and bands that we both play in. But his main instrument is trumpet, and this was like a jazz jam. And he was playing trumpet at this jam, and I met him there. And there's a whole, little group of musicians that I met through that I, have had these still long, incredibly long, uh, lasting relationships. And I always looked up to them then because they were, very accomplished musicians. They were professional musicians. Another guy that I met who I still play with today, and he's gone on to become a really great friend, is Glenn Dubois. Another just phenomenal musician. And I looked up to them at that age, and I still do now. And fast forward many, many years later, I was fortunate enough to play in all of these different bands with them and different projects, and I always, throughout those years, have always learned so much from them. And we've become friends, but same thing. I look up to them, because they always had a different perspective just because of their huge sense of experience. So it was always really cool. And shortly after that, I eventually, and during that time, I started, slowly making connections, and I started playing these little like pickup gigs, and I was, people were, in the area or whatnot were having little parties, or so they were looking to hire bands, and then I met these guys that I met at this jam. We kind of over time got to know each other, and then I started playing gigs with them, and they were like my first, gigs in the area, and so it was a cool like little process of like slowly networking with musicians, and then eventually that I played in this one band that was like the first time I was ever, at least in Maine, I was ever in a band that was a regular, kind of thing, and it was a band called Tree by Leaf, and it was a really great band. They had a really big following at one point, but it was different than the other things I was doing because it was all original music. And so I met somebody through that band, my friend Kelly, who was actually married to the keyboard player, and she was a kind of a booking agent for that band. She did a lot of work. I remember at the time where she booked gigs for them, but then she also did, and this is going back years ago, but she also was really involved with like doing the promotional aspects. And that's how I met her, and that's how I knew her. That was the capacity of how like we knew each other. And then, fast forward many years later, I kind of reconnected with her, and I've been hanging out with her and keeping in touch with her. And she, since that period, she hasn't really done that kind of work anymore. She doesn't really do that work as far as acting as a booking agent. But she also has this other, what she does do now is she has this really pretty cool little gig or job where she writes music reviews for, for this. There's a British, an English online music magazine, and she writes reviews for them. She's been to Europe a bunch of times, and she actually has been to England a bunch of times. She was just there this past summer. So she's got a connection there. But this British magazine she started writing reviews for. So she is really into music. She's got a huge vinyl collection. She's pretty serious. So in conversations, we're talking about stuff and bands that we might both be into. I pose that question. So what are your top 10 bands? Go, kind of thing. And a lot of the times, you know, sometimes it's almost like that question when you ask somebody, what kind of music are you into? And I don't know, in some ways, I think some people think of that as just kind of, I don't know, the sense that I get from people when I ask people that, like, sometimes I'll just ask, like, in conversation with somebody, I will like say, hey, what kind of movies do you like, or what's your top go to movies, or what's your favorite top to go to bands, and sometimes people think that's like, I don't know, too much of a generic question, or it's kind of a cheesy, cliched question to ask someone, and and then typically a lot of times what I get from people when you ask them that, they'll say, well, I listen to everything. The only thing I don't listen to, like the typical response people will say, the only thing I don't listen to is I don't like country and western, or I don't like new rap music. Like, that's a typical thing, but it always seems like the response is, well, I like everything. And then they'll say, everything but like country. That's like a typical response. And then occasionally they'll say, "Well, I don't like that rap music." And I always think that's funny. I think that's more of a cheesier response than the actual question, but that's just me. But when I ask somebody that, I'm pretty genuine about it. I think it really says a lot about that person. I think for me at least, when I ask people those questions, I learn a lot about a person. It's kind of like that thing that I've always been locked into, or an aspect of, where you kind of maybe develop a relationship with somebody. It's I've always thought of like the scenario of like if you go over someone's house, say for the first time, and they're maybe they have a little movie collection, and they're out in display, say in the living room, or especially you'll see that they have a book collection somewhere. And usually, typically, what I do, especially if I don't know that person so well, but it happens anyway. But if I'm in that situation and I go over to someone's house or their apartment or whatever, I'll during you know that situation, I'll like actually check out what books they have, or I'll see, oh, okay, they have this on DVD or on VHS. Oh, okay. And I find for myself, I totally learn about what this person is into. I learn a lot, not even having a conversation about it. And to me, it usually tells a lot about the person's interests. And to me, that's a really cool thing by just, you know, even just glancing at someone's bookshelf as to what books they have. And to me, I can like learn a lot about that person through that. But that question that comes up every now and when I ask them like what their favorite movies are, their favorite bands are. Like to me, that's always, you know, I'm, you know, people look at it as a cliched question, but I'm pretty genuine about it. And on one hand, sometimes people will say, most of the time, people will say, "Well, I like everything." But then when you ask them, like, name a couple of bands or name a couple of things, and I know it always seems to happen with, particularly around the younger generation. And I ask them, well, like, no, like, what are some of the bands you're into, or some of the movies and then they can't really name them. I always find that's kind of a funny thing. They'll say, well, I like this song, or I like this band, or this or that, but it's really random, or they don't know the band that they're really talking about. Like they might just name a couple of songs, but that makes them a fan. It's always kind of funny. But I think that's more of a generational thing. But with Kelly, it's a whole different kind of scenario. And, when people ask me that, I I don't usually for this channel, I don't always I don't have like a typical thing that you see on YouTube, especially around people who review movies, or bands, especially when you're coming to the beginning of a new year, is they do their top 20 list of best or worst movies that they've seen, or best albums that they've bought, or worst albums they've bought. So it's but I typically don't do shows like that, just because I don't know, I have, as a fan of media, I have a lot of things that I love, a lot of things that I check out, so it's always hard for me to kind of pinpoint what my top, you know, tier would be. But at the same time, it is something I think about quite a bit, and I usually keep those kinds of lists pretty loose, even though I do have those. I definitely do have my go-to things that I always check out, my top, favorite bands, or my top favorite directors, uh, some of my all-time favorite movies, and I talked about that on this channel, and I do have those lists, but they're a little bit more informal, just because I find, it shifts a lot. Sometimes I'll see something, or I'll hear something for the first time, or revisit something, um, and it will, make the list, or that informal list, but it will like shift things around. Or something that I really liked at one point, I start realizing that maybe I'm not really into it, so it's always kind of shifting. But I do always have an informal list. And like I did a show on I have done shows on this channel, which people are probably aware of. I have done shows on like top tier or top, you know, like I did a show on my top, my favorite director of all time, Stanley Kubrick. I did a big show on that. Like to me, that's pretty definitive for me personally. And I also did a big show a while back on my favorite movie of all time, The Godfather. So I do have that, and it is a thing. But and I did a show recently, kind of in that vein, where I did a show on Apocalypse Now, which is my favorite Blu-ray that I own. I have a pretty good selection of movies. I've really, moved my purchasing habits on focusing on Blu-rays. And the that movie, the director's cut, Apocalypse Now Redux is my most probably cherished possession, just because of the just how glorious of a package it is. And so it is a thing that I do cover, even though I don't know, I approach it a little bit differently. And so today's show is about a movie that I've actually been wanting to get to do a show. I've been wanting to talk about it for a long time. And I kind of feel like this might be my favorite, even though it's completely on, at, for the most part, I think it's completely like a new version of a character or of a movie that has been done many times, and that is The Invisible Man. I think for me, this came out about 3 years ago, which is hard to believe. 2020, it's ridiculous, and I have a whole like interesting story around this film, aside from talking about this marvelous movie. And technically, I think of this movie as a remake because it's the you have it's tied to the whole. The Invisible Man is tied to the whole Universal monster uh, canon. The Universal monsters, the classic monsters, where you had Lon Chaney Jr. playing the Wolfman. You had Boris Karloff playing Frankenstein. Bela Lugosi playing Dracula. Other monsters that I include in that would be the creature from the Black Lagoon, and then also the Mummy, who was also played by Bela Lugosi. I mean, by Boris Karloff, and also the Invisible Man, and all of those monsters. And then I think another one that I would have to include would be Doctor Jekyll and Mister Hyde. So you have all of those monsters under the banner of, basically Universal Studios brought those monsters to light, and they've gone on to become iconic, monsters in our world. And with Dracula, obviously, was probably that's been the most that's had the biggest spotlight on it, just because of how well vampire movies onto itself. That's probably in that uh, situation. That's probably the most the biggest of genre. There's been thousands of vampire movies, and they still come out. Thousands of different renditions and incarnations, and various different stories around, you know, uh, vampire oriented movies. You have movies like, say, Near Dark, just an amazing movie, or movies like even like Twilight, or you have, you know, Let the Right One In, which is an amazing movie. I mean, you have the full gamut. You have like really silly, cheesy vampire movies, but then you have these really great, fantastic. From Dusk Till Dawn's another one that I just think is amazing. And along with that, there's also been, 10 billion incarnations of Dracula. You know, my favorite probably being Bram Stoker's Dracula, that was starring Gary Oldman, which I think is just the most definitive version of that character. There's, the Wes Craven did a Dracula movie. There's, you know, a whole, Frank Langella. He did an amazing version of that character in Dracula from 1979. And also, one of my all-time favorite movies is Dracula vs. Frankenstein, which is just an amazing exploitation movie. Uh, Christopher Lee, of course, the icon that he is. So there's been, a bazillion different incarnations of Dracula itself. So I think in that, that family of the Universal monsters, the whole attraction to vampires and Dracula, that's the biggest probably in that entire, category. And obviously with Frankenstein, that's very, very big too. I think with, you have everything from, like, well, the Robert De Niro version of that, but then you have the, Roger Corman films around it. You have the Hammer films that made a lot of Frankenstein movies. There's a lot of newer ones that came out. Even Andy Warhol directed a version of that. So there's like a pretty big, huge spectrum in that, in that genre. And I think with obviously the Wolfman and werewolves, you have American Werewolf in London. You have, Underworld, which is another movie with Kate Beckinsale. You have, Silver Bullet. My favorite werewolf film of all time would be The Howling. Paul Naschy, who I've done some shows on, who's one of the greatest you know exploitation actors and also one of my favorite directors. He's he was responsible for many incarnations of the Wolfman. So there's tons of incarnations of the Wolfman. But that being said, I think the Dracula and movies around the whole vampire mythology, that is the largest. There's also been many incarnations of the Mummy, many movies, also in the Hammer, the old school Hammer from the Hammer Studios that were most well known for all of their Dracula movies played by Christopher Lee, but there was also a whole bunch of mummy films that came out, and then you have the classic, which I think is probably my favorite, the classic one with Boris Karloff, which is an incredibly creepy movie. And then you have even the Brendan Fraser movies that came out many years later that are really silly and kind of terrible. But so, and then also with The Invisible Man, there's actually been a whole bunch of those. Probably not as, obviously not as huge, but definitely there has been a bunch of. There was the Invisible Man remake that came out with Kevin Bacon a few years back. There's also movies that came out in the 50s and 60s centered on that character. And then also Abbott and Costello. The famous comedy troupe, they also did a big show and movie where they incorporated all the Universal monsters that included Frankenstein and Dracula and the Invisible Man. There's been quite a few renditions of that. One of my favorites, which I haven't seen and I've always been surprised, but The Creature of the Black Lagoon is one of my favorite Universal monsters. I love the original. I think as far as the original Universal monster movies, I would probably say my favorite would probably be the original with Boris Karloff, where he portrays Frankenstein. But I also think, and obviously Lon Chaney as the Wolfman. I'm not. This might be a controversial thing to say, but I'm not really I think his presence and the way his demeanor and um, the way he portrays him is magnificent. But I'm not a huge fan of the original Bela Lugosi movie. I'm not really the movie. I think his whole presence and the whole like kind of aesthetic around that film is incredible and amazing and awesome. But I'm not a huge fan of that movie. I don't think. I think compared to especially the original Universal monster movies, I feel like that movie isn't really very strong. I don't, and it doesn't to me. It doesn't really resemble, even though that it happens with a lot of those films. You know, with Frankenstein, it doesn't really. I don't really think it is tied at all to some of the original work or the character that was created by Bram Stoker. I don't. It's so for me. It's like really so far removed from the book and the essence and the kind of the erotic element. It doesn't. I don't know. It's to me the movie itself isn't very good. I just think it's pretty dated, and I don't know. I was never a huge fan of that movie, but the other movies I've always loved. Even though, like for example, Boris Karloff's rendition is great. And Mary Shelley's the original book Frankenstein. I think is definitely one of my favorite monster stories. I think it's uh, an amazing timeless. It's a timeless classic. And even though the Universal monster version of that movie is so different from the book, I think it has a lot of the themes, like the darker, heavier themes that are very much I feel connected, with that book, where it has this heavy quality to it, and I think that they still have that in that movie. Whereas Bela Lugosi, the Bela Lugosi version, for me doesn't have any connection to the story created by Bram Stoker in any way, shape, or form. So, but there's also examples of that also, like getting sticking with Dracula. Hammer, the Hammer horror films, they obviously have nothing to do with at all with the original source material, created by Bram Stoker. And even, Christopher Lee has said in many interviews over the years that he was always really critical of what Hammer Studios did, or their whole thing of taking this iconic character but just making it a lot more goofier or a lot sillier and just a little bit more over the top and more campy. And he never understood why he always felt that the original book, Bram Stoker's original book, was such a classic. He always felt he was always trying to like get them to adapt that story more, you know, to come into that more and more and make the character have a little bit more of a bring some more depth to the character. And he always was at odds with the studio because of that. But Hammer Studios never really wanted to do that. They wanted to do something that was a little bit more over the top, obviously, and more campy and just a little bit more salacious. And it doesn't really none of those films resemble the original book in any way, shape, or form. And again, it's just personal taste, but that's why I love those movies so much, because they are so different. They're not trying to replicate that story. They took it in a much more of a over the top kind of scenario, and it's a little bit more of a theatrical. Um, it's a little bit more campy, and they took in a much different direction. They took it into like kind of another extreme, and I think because they did that, it actually makes those movies really work. But again, that's just personal preference. But this movie here, I think, and I look at this as The Invisible Man as being technically a remake because it is based on the original Universal monster, and like I said, all of those iconic monsters, all of those movies came out around the same time in like the 30s and 40s and changed the face of horror forever. And there has been many renditions of The Invisible Man. So I do look at it as a remake, but at the same time, it's completely fresh and original in every way, shape, or form. But I definitely feel like this is the definitive version of the Invisible Man, and it is the greatest version of anything tied to this monster by far. No questions asked. And this amazing movie, and again, like I said, it's technically a remake, but it's so utterly original and so and such a fresh story. It's such a fresh story, and it's so. I think that like a definitive version of, and I talk about films, where I look at them as being kind of their own standalone films. To me, this is like the very definition of a of or the best example of a standalone film. Like this really is like the quintessential standalone film. Even though it is a remake, technically, uh, just amazing. And this film came out in 2020, which is hard to believe, and it was written and directed by Leigh Whannell, who is a Australian screenwriter. And Leigh Whannell, I think one of the most. Since I saw this movie, I saw it in the theater, and I rented it after that following year, I think, when it came out on DVD, and then I bought it on Blu-ray, and I've seen it a bunch of times, and it's one of my favorite modern day horror films. Like in general, I think it's probably as a whole, it would be, like I was talking about top tier list or top 20 list. This film, I think, would definitely make that list now if it was, if I was going forging ahead and making that definitive list. I definitely think this movie would be included, and I think it's one of the best, more modern day horror films I that's ever been made. I just think it's an amazing movie, and not just a modern horror film, but I think it's, you know, just an incredible movie, and just such great atmosphere, so well directed. The acting is just incredible. The story is really great. I love how original it is, and at the heart of its movie, at the core of this movie, I feel like it's such it's so it's driven so much by not only great characters, but it's such a great suspense movie, and it doesn't necessarily rely on, quote unquote, which happens a lot for newer horror films, but I'm a fan of it. But when it's done well, but it doesn't rely on the jump scare kind of thing, which is a thing that happens a lot in films now. Probably as far as newer films and or newer horror films, I think it's something that happens too often. I notice it is even used in films that are pretty good to a degree, and even in that light, I think it's overused too much. I think, well, one example, which I thought was a good movie, but then at the end of the day, I kind of thought it was a little bit too much of a ripoff of a movie that, in many ways, way more of a successful venture. But there was a movie that came out very recently called Smile, which a newer horror film that had a lot of critical acclaim and was really talked about. It made quite a bit of money. It's good, but then I felt that movie was, at the end of the day, suffered for me, from my perspective, and as a fan of horror, it suffered too much of it being a ripoff of a really great film that I would also include probably in that informal list. This film that came out called It Follows, which I thought was a breath of fresh air as far as a newer horror film, and I think it's one of the best and one of the most original horror films that's come out in quite a few years. But after I watched Smile, I felt like, well, it's kind of a total ripoff of that story. It has some really great things to that. There are some really great things about that movie that are very, very intense, and it's shocking. It's pretty disturbing. There are some great things about that movie, and I think that movie's worth checking out. But it ultimately, I feel looking back at it, and especially after I saw it, and I had it, I was sitting with it, you know, thinking about it for a couple of days afterwards. It just reminded me too much of It Follows to the point of where I came to the conclusion that it just totally ripped it off, and Smile really wasn't, really by any stretch of the imagination, it really wasn't a an original movie because it was kind of hyped as being something that was new and fresh, but it really wasn't. But that movie, again, it had some good attributes to it, but it also, one of the things I didn't like about that film is it kind of got into the whole jump scare thing a little bit too much. And it was a little bit ham handed, and they didn't really need to do that because there was a cool thing established. It was a cool atmosphere. It does have a slow burn to it at times, and there's some pretty good characters in that movie. So it didn't really have to. I feel like it was a little bit of a, maybe due to maybe due to the studio executives thinking that they needed to throw in these jump scares to make more money because that's a popular thing. But it ended up, I think, for that film, it ended up kind of backfired. But with the Invisible Man, it doesn't have it. I guess you could say it does have jump scares in it, but it's so well done, and those moments are so well placed in the story that it really, each time that the so-called, if you want to call it that, the so-called jump scare would happen, it's so effective because for me as a viewer, I was in the palm of their hand, and the filmmakers, and that they could take me anywhere at that point. So I was in it to win it, and it, at the core, it's such a great suspense movie, and it just really relies on that tension the whole way through, and you're being pulled in more and more. And like I said, Leigh Whannell, I think, is easily one of the best working figures in Hollywood. I think he's one of the greatest and most talented writers. I think he's one of the best directors. I'm really anxious to see what he does next because it's been about 3 years, and I'm not sure. I haven't heard anything else of what he's got coming down the pike. But I just think he's an like I said, just a great writer. He's a really great director. He's got really great taste, and he's got a diverse, pretty cool and very diverse track record. Leigh Whannell is probably most known for writing and actually starring in the first Saw movie, which gave birth to a massive franchise. And I do, as a franchise, I am a pretty big fan of the Saw franchise, especially the first one. I think it's a really great movie. I think it was really unique, really different. It ushered in. It was a very influential movie. Sometimes that movie gets a bad rap because people label it as, well, I don't know, Saw. I'm not really into, like, I've heard people who don't like that movie or kind of poo-poo on it or poo-poo it. They say, well, it's just torture porn. It's just people, like, being thrown into a room and tortured and blah blah blah. And that movie, gave birth to this whole other weird subgenre in horror called, torture porn. And I don't really think that that's true. I think if you look at the movie for what it is, it is graphic, and it does get into some of those aspects where torture is a part of it, but it's such a great movie. It's such a well crafted story, and I think that movie was a really, is a real original piece of work, and it was very influential. It did inspire lots of other films that kind of, we're trying to capitalize on what they did with that film. And it was, of course, directed by James Wong, who is a real famous director in the horror world. He went on to direct a lot more horror films: Insidious, I believe The Conjuring, which I really love. The first Conjuring I think is great. Uh, and he went on to direct more of the Saw films, and that franchise exploded. That's a huge franchise, but I do like that. I haven't seen all of those films, but I do like it for the most part. Um, the first two I think are just awesome, awesome movies. I almost like the second one even more, but they're both really great movies, and the rest of them I think are really good, or pretty solid, pretty consistent. I haven't seen all of them, but one day I will. But like I said, Leigh Whannell, that's probably what he's most well known for, is writing and starring in that movie, the first Saw movie. Uh, and he also wrote some of the Insidious movies, which is, now that I think of it, I've never seen those. I don't know why. I've heard that those films are really great. Um, I do want to see them. There is a movie he wrote and directed, which I think is just a kind of a masterpiece in the world of sci-fi, and that's called Upgrade, and that came out in 2018. A movie that I never hear about, I never hear people talk about, and I always say, if you're a fan, well, if you're a fan of good movies, but especially if you're a fan of really great sci-fi horror oriented movies, Upgrade is like an amazing movie. I saw that a couple of years ago after I saw the uh, the Invisible Man, and it's just incredible. It's such an awesome movie, and he's been involved. Leigh Whannell's been involved with writing original content and also directing films, and I feel like he's got a real diverse um, collection of different projects he's been in. And I just think he's like one of the most talented guys around. Um, and like again, I'm looking forward to see what he does next. Very much can't wait to see what he does next. It's been a few years. Um, and the Invisible Man, this movie right here was the movie that on how I became aware of him as a writer and director. Um, and I think that this movie too, the cast for this film is so good. It's such a great cast. The characters are all um, so well flushed out. I care about everyone that I see on the screen. Uh, of course, this stars Elisabeth Moss, who is the star of this movie. And I think she's been around in lots of different films. She's been around for quite a few years now. And I've seen her in lots of different things. She's done other horror movies. She's done dramas. She's also done television shows. Um, this is easily the best thing I've ever seen her in. Elizabeth Moss is a powerhouse of an actress, just tremendous. And I think that this movie, I think the acting in this film itself is so good on a level that it's not only just an incredible horror movie. I think it's a great movie, and I feel like this movie, in particularly Elizabeth Moss, I think it was at a level of I totally felt that she should have gotten nominated or won the Academy Award for that year, because she was probably, from what I remember, like you know one of the best, one of the best roles I've ever seen on the big screen. Not only for horror but just films in general. She's amazing in it. And 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 again, it's such a great film that I look at it as just a great film, not only a great horror film. She's a powerhouse, and the cast for this whole movie is just terrific. Oliver Jackson, Aldous Hodge, who is just awesome, who plays her friend, Stormy Reed plays the daughter, Harriet Dyer, Michael Dorman, Bianca Capone. Um, the cast is just great. just tremendous. Um, and the other thing that is so awesome about this movie, I got to see this on the big screen. I got to see we saw this at Flagship Cinema. I went with my good friend Emmett Layler, and we saw it when it came out. It was opening weekend, and we saw it at Flagship. And the I was just blown away. We went into the movie totally cold. I had seen a brief review of the film. One of the guys I check out a lot on YouTube is this guy by the name of Chris Stuckman, who I think is definitely one of the best guys on YouTube as far as when it comes to reviewing films. And he mostly most of his focus, most of the focus, or most of the movies that he talks about for his channel are all like newer films. So when I want to like try to get a general idea or on if something is pretty good that's a newer film or know a little bit about it, I'll usually check out a little bit of his check out his reviews or check out a little bit of those reviews. And I generally from my perspective, and I've been following him for a few years now, about 99% of the time I find that he is so spot on when it comes to his coverage of newer films, particularly newer horror films. And every time I've watched a video or recommendation of something that he's talked about of a newer movie, and then I've gone to see it, I am in like 100% agreement with his review. Just tremendous. One of the things that I try to do now is try when I go to a movies, I try to stay away from hearing hearing anything about the movie. I'll hear obviously I'll hear about the movie somehow. Maybe there's a little bit of buzz about it or something. But I generally try to stay away from reading any kind of reviews. I might even if there's like trailers available, which there usually are. I'll usually just watch a little bit of a trailer. Sometimes I'll watch trailers. Um, Generally, I think it's pretty rough and it's pretty tough to watch trailers now because I feel like a lot of movies uh, there's too much revealed in a lot of the trailers, so it kind of lets the surprise out, lets the cat out of the bag. And I don't know why that is a thing. It's really terrible from being a fan of seeing new movies or particular horror films. Um, but so when I came across this film, I went into it totally cold. Years back in the day, I used to be the opposite. I used to when I would hear about a movie or hear maybe I knew somebody who saw a newer film or I hear some kind of buzz about a film. I was at one point totally the opposite. I would before I would go see it, I would read all of the reviews I could find. I would watch all the trailers I could find. I would do all of this I do all of this like research. And if generally a lot of the times like I would eventually see it anyway or I would see the film anyway. But generally if I see a film where you know across the board everything is really positive, for me that would be like the definitive thing to go see it. And even if it was mixed or whatever, I would eventually see it. But usually when I would find out about a movie, that's what I would do. And I found over time, and I went through that whole process for a while, but I found over time when I would, and especially now where it's different because with the way trailers are handled now, is that there's too many plot reveals in trailers, and they're a lot of the times they're like condensed versions of the movie, and there is no surprise. You know what the story is. You even know, and in some the worst part of it, you know how the film is gonna end, and it's terrible. It doesn't make any sense, and I think it's a marketing thing for companies to try to like I don't know somehow in their rationale of showing so much in the trailers, they somehow think, well, that's going to just maybe bring people in more to see it because they know a little bit more about it. I'm not sure, but I think most of the time it totally backfires, and it's not what trailers are. Trailers are supposed to give you some information, but it should leave you with even more questions, and you don't really know what's going on. You get a very broad, kind of synopsis of what the story is, but it should be just enough to kind of pull you in, make you excited, and and to give you that feeling like I got to go see this. I don't, and also to have a feeling of I'm not really sure what it's about. It looks interesting. It looks kind of mysterious, or it looks pretty scary, but I don't really know what it's about. But it looks interesting. And at one point, a lot of trailers were handled that way. And there's an art form to trailers, particularly in the exploitation world, which I think a lot of the exploitation directors are, they're masters of marketing and masters of making trailers. Like, you can't beat any of that stuff. And occasionally there are trailers that come out now that do that, where they just give you enough information to kind of pull you in. But generally now it's there's too many plot reveals, and it's too much. And a lot of the trailers now, they used to be, maybe a minute or 2 minutes. Now there's a lot of trailers that are like 5 minutes long, and it's kind of ridiculous. Recently I went to the theater to see the new Ant-Man movie, which was a big pile of steaming crap. And I saw a couple of trailers in the theater. I went with my buddy Aiden, and it was the same thing. The movies that I saw the trailers for, the new Guardians of the Galaxy, the new Indiana Jones movie that's coming out, they look good, but they show too much. Like, I kind of know what's happening in the movies, and these trailers were each 5 minutes long, and it was like, I want to see those movies, especially Guardians, but it it was too much. There's too many things kind of revealed just in that little span of time. Um, but one of so but what I do now for when I go to movies is I try to go into a film as cold as possible. I try not to. I might check out a little bit of a trailer, but I generally try to stay away from trailers. And if I hear something about a movie, maybe it's like I see it come up in my feed when I'm checking out stuff on YouTube or whatever, and I see that there's like talk of this movie and people are saying pretty good things about it. I what I sometimes do, and what I did specifically for this movie, I kept hearing about this movie called The Invisible Man, and I heard it was, kind of a remake, and that it was the director, the writer was involved with the first Saw movie, and it's actually supposed to be really good. And I remember, but I didn't know anything about it outside. It was just very at a very low level. I had a very limited amount of information about the movie, but I heard it was actually supposed to be really good. So I remember during this time when we saw this movie, I went to Chris Stuckman's channel, and he had written a review about The Invisible Man, and he said that it was one of the best movies that he had seen that year, and that it was one of the best horror movies. He thought it was just really fantastic. But he did a thing where it was there was no spoilers, and I only watched like half of the review, and at that point I found a lot of the things like I said, 99% of the reviews that he gives for movies, I agree with him, and he pretty much knocks it out of the park, and I totally agree with a lot of the recommendations and reviews that he talks about in this channel, especially newer movies. So I literally had like 5 minutes of information where this guy who I really respect was saying, this is really good. You got to go see it in the theater, especially in the theater. And then I shut off the review. I didn't watch anything else about it. That was it. And then I remember talking to my friend Emmett, and we were like, hey, you want to go to the movies? I heard that there's this really cool movie coming out this weekend called The Invisible Man. I don't know much about it, but I heard from what I've heard it might be really good. It might be a really, just a really kick-ass horror film. So we went to it, and again, I didn't know anything about it, very little. He didn't know anything about it, my friend. So we went, and I was we were both blown away by how great it was. One of the most powerful components of this movie is the music. The film score, which was composed by Benjamin Wallfisch, is just incredible. It's one of the best soundtracks for horror films, I think in general. Definitely that year. The film score is so powerful, and to see it on the big screen, it was so immersive and so intense, and it just created so much atmosphere. Because this film is at times a little bit on the slow side. It on the slow side. It has, you're getting this, you're slowly getting this information, and it's a little bit of a slow burn, and there's lots of scenes where there's not a whole lot of dialogue, and it's a slow build. But the music for this film is so atmospheric and so intense. Like, it's amazing. It's one of the best film scores that I've ever heard. And I was just blown away. And when we saw it in the theater, I felt like it was so strong that it felt like it was its own character in the movie. It was so, it just built all of this tension, and it acted like again, like I felt like it acted like a character to the movie. Just incredible. And then we saw it, and I was just blown away by this film, and I was like, this was awesome. And I remember we talked about it quite a bit after the subsequent days after, we kept talking about that movie, and I remember bringing it up to people, saying, you should check this movie out. It's really good. And it was, and it was the last movie, The Invisible Man, this one that came out in 2020, which is hard to believe it's 3 years ago. This was the last movie I saw in the theater for quite a long time. A few months later, COVID hit, and the world shut down, and the world has never been the same since, and everything changed. This was literally the last movie I saw in the theater then, and I didn't go back to the movies. I started going back to the movies not this past summer, but I think it was the summer before I started going. So about a year ago, I started going to the movies again. But it had been about 2 years since I'd even been to the theater. And this was the last movie I saw in the theater. And I guess, to a degree, what a way to go out. I mean, we went out with a bang for that year. And I know, we're 3 years into the whole COVID thing, and it's something that is still talked about, and maybe it's redundant, and people don't want to hear about it, or people, are just sick and tired of it, or just, all of the different things that it brings up for people. And, it's really something we'll always talk about. It's something we're still living with, but it's something that I know from my perspective was, when I think about the last 3 years, how life was then when, say, when COVID first came about, and then suddenly within a few weeks, the world literally shut down. Like, every facet of the world shut down. To where we are now, to where over time there was a sense of, a quote unquote return to kind of maybe how life was before COVID. But I feel like now, even though we're still living with it, people still get it. There are still things that are greatly affected by COVID. It is still something there. It is, luckily, I feel like things have moved in a much more positive direction around it, and people are more or less free to be people again, and to kind of go back to enjoying their lives more. But it's something we're still living with, and I feel that shift, that whole predicament change, or like that, the whole shift and the whole change that we went through will be something that, to some degree, we will never go back to what we were, I feel. It was, I mean, for me personally, it was the darkest thing and the darkest experience I have ever had in my entire life. It was, and I like to, for shows and for what I do in this channel, I try not to be, I'm obviously passionate about certain things. I'm really enthusiastic about a lot of things. Sometimes I go on too long about certain things, and I try to, like, focus, bring in a little bit more focus each time to what, the point of the channel is. And I look at this channel as being a thing of where it's a passion project. It's a love of mine. It's all about the movies I love. But and I try not to get I don't know, talk too much about personal things. But this movie has a real, not only, like I said, I think it's one of the greatest movies, one of the best horror movies, easily within the last few years, and I think it's one of the best horror movies in general. I just think it's amazing. This movie has gone on to become just generally one of my all-time favorites. Um, but this movie also, for me, has such a significance. Every time I think of this movie or hear about it, it makes me think of COVID, because that memory of how I discovered COVID and when it first came is, to me, is etched in stone with this movie. And I know we all, like, there are people out there that suffer for many things. We live in a really, I think, overall, a real complicated world, and I also feel we live in a world where there's, you know there's an immense source of inspiration. We live in a world that has incredible beauty, but then also has incredible horror. And I think a lot of it has to do, obviously, with our environment, but then also our perception and how we feel we relate to ourselves, most importantly, but then also the world around us. And I do feel at the end of the day that we, as people, can create that reality to a degree of the world we want to live in. Whether it's on a small scale or on a bigger scale, especially more on the smaller scale. But I think people are capable. I feel people are limitless to where they can take those kinds of ideas, for good or bad. But I, the way I came about hearing about COVID was, it was we saw this. This came out, I think, in early January, maybe early February of 2020, and by uh, March and April, that was when COVID had hit, and then by that point, by, like, I think it was early April, the world was, at least at that point, or at least it seemed, the world ended. Like, everything shut down. Um, and the way I discovered, when I first heard about the coronavirus, it was so weird, and it was directly related to films. So Emmett and I had just seen The Invisible Man, and we were both just like, this movie was just so kick ass, so awesome. I remember a few days after I saw The Invisible Man, I looked it up online, and I was curious because I didn't hear a lot about this movie. I didn't hear a lot of hype about it. And I looked at some of the reviews. The reviews are really, really good. It had a lot of positive reviews. I had looked at some other people talking about it on YouTube, and it was like really positive reviews. So it had buzz, but it didn't seem like it was marketed as like a potential blockbuster kind of a thing. And I remember looking it up online a few weeks after I saw it, and I was curious to see if it, like, how much money it made. Was it successful? Because I thought, I really loved it. I really love this movie, and I was like, I hope this movie does well. I hope they make their money back, or make, twice the amount of money back, because it's just such an awesome movie. And I remember looking it up online, and I saw this article where it said that The Invisible Man was doing really well. It was commercially, it was a hit. But then there was an interview with some of the executives that worked on this film, the company that had released the film, and they were talking about their concerns about that they might either have to take the movie out of the theater at some point, or because of this impending virus that was coming to our shores. And I was like, what is this? And that was the first time where they talked about, that I came across. They were talking about, there's been this a virus that's been identified in China called the coronavirus. And at that point, there was the first, I believe it was the first case of the coronavirus that had hit the States, and it was in New York. And it was spreading like incredibly fast. Within a couple of days, there was like thousands and thousands of cases. And this was way before there were any vaccines or anything. So people had no idea what the hell was going on. And the filmmakers, especially the people, the company that distributed this movie, were talking about on how they were worried that they were going to have to pull the movie early because it had come out literally a month or a few weeks before it hit the shores here in the States with the coronavirus. And I was just like, what the hell is this coronavirus thing? I'm like, what? What is this? This is, I kind of couldn't believe what I was reading. And then after that, I started doing some reading about it, and I was just like, I was blown away. I was like, the coronavirus, what the hell's going on here? And then within a few weeks, the world, on paper ended, and I was just like, oh my God, like, and I look back at that particular time, and I think a lot of people do, but I look at back at that time as being, um, and this is just me personally, I look at that whole time frame as being the darkest thing I've ever experienced in my entire life. I mean, you talk about upheaval and just pure and utter disorientation in every conceivable way that you can possibly imagine. Um, this was an example of it. Unlike any experience I could even remotely compare it to, it was the most surreal experience ever. I've always been a really big fan of post-apocalyptic stories or science fiction stories, particularly like things like Blade Runner, George Miller's Road Warrior, that franchise, Children of Men, films like that. And I Am Legend, The Omega Man, all of those classic, post-apocalyptic post-apocalyptic stories. Another one that I thought is just tremendous is uh, McCormick's The Road. That's always been one of my favorite genres. And I remember when the world when it seemingly came to an end, or it was on paper, it was over, and everything was locked down. I remember getting into my car, and this was only like 3 or 4 weeks after I'd seen this movie. I remember getting in my car and driving around aimlessly, and everything was shut down and everything was dark, there were other series of events that happened after that where, for me, it was like a genre that I loved. I was now seeing this happen, and things that I saw happen and felt like things were happening, or that things were moving in a certain direction that were directly from that was taken directly from that source material. And I felt like I experienced things and saw things that I never thought, literally in a billion years, that would ever happen. Um, there's always been a sense, uh, particularly around social issues and political issues. Uh, there's always been a real, I think, dystopian connection, that I love from that genre that I've always seen in our world, especially like, say, the way corporations act in our world, and the where they go unchecked for all of these horrible crimes that they kind of commit, and things that they do to the environment and to people. And with politics, there's always been these parallels, financial strains that people are put through when the stock market crashes. all of these things that people have been put through, and then also the way law enforcement, you know, and kind of the militarization of our, you know, global policy. All those things I've always felt are like direct parallels from this, that were taken. I've always felt are direct parallels from this whole post-apocalyptic kind of scenario. But this was different. This was like real world, and this was, it brought it to a level where there were things I just never actually ever imagined seeing with my own eyes actually see happen. And at one point, I literally felt for a long time that the world was collapsing and everything was going to end, and that the only way you could exist was going to be purely based on your survival instincts. Where I became this person of like suddenly I was kind of doing my life, I was kind of doing what I did, went to my job and did this or did that, and just had a sense of routine and normalcy to a degree, and just kind of being like everyone else, to where I suddenly all of that stuff was gone, completely and utterly gone. And at one point I went to this level of where the only thing I can do is worry about protecting myself and my family. And it was the most profound experience I've ever had. Um, so I feel like because of that, there will be ramifications that I will probably have to deal with for the rest of my life because of those scenarios, and I think lots of people will. Um, Luckily, things seem to have gotten better, but this movie for me is tied to that directly because of the timing. I mean, just an an unbelievable experience. But that being said, The Invisible Man, an amazing movie. This Blu-ray edition is just incredible. Um, it's I actually enjoy this more actually watching it on Blu-ray. I have a really great sound system, and like again I said, the score for this film is just incredible, and the atmosphere. And I actually enjoy this movie watching this at home. An amazing movie. I can't wait to see what comes next from this amazing director. So thanks again. If you like this channel, please like and subscribe to it, and we will see you next time. Have a great day. Peace.